In the 5th grade, we were given an opportunity to join band or choir. And at the time, my family watched a lot of TV. And so at night, I would watch Happy Days with the Fonz and Richie Cunningham. And Richie Cunningham played the saxophone, and I wanted to be just like Richie Cunningham. So I told them that I wanted to play the saxophone. Well, they told me, no, you got to play the clarinet. You're too small. Your fingers won't reach. And so I laid down the gauntlet, and I said, if I can't play the saxophone, I'm not joining your band. So they let me pick up the alto saxophone. The only time I picked up that instrument in 5th grade, 6th grade, or 7th grade was when I was in band class, in school, because I had to. That's the only time I touched that horn. But in 7th grade, I was getting really frustrated because I was getting A's in all my other subjects except for band. So I went in to complain to Mr. Sills. Mr. Sills, you're giving me B's. And he said, oh, no, Mark Vanderpool, you're earning B's because you're not doing anything. You're not practicing. I mean, I got to admit, you show up, blah, blah, blah. But he told me, you want to get an A in band? You got to practice 30 minutes a day, 5 days out of the week. And you got to fill out a form and your parents have to sign. I was so mad at him. So I did something I had never done before. Instead of watching TV at night, I started practicing my alto saxophone. And I did this 5 days a week. Sometimes I would do it 6 days a week because I wanted that A. Funny thing. In 7th grade, out of 13 saxophone players, I was in chair 13. In other words, of all 13, I was the worst of all of them. But in 8th grade, at the beginning of the year in tryouts, guess who moved from 13th place to first chair? Yeah. What? Practicing every night, 5, 6 nights out of the week, instead of watching TV, instead of smoking my candy cigarettes. Practicing actually made me a better musician. It is odd to me how many people I meet in life who are like the 5th grade version of me. In other words, they fall in love. Will you marry me? Oh, yes, I'll marry you. They launch a career. Oh, I'm going to be a veterinarian, or I'm going to be a nurse, or I'm going to be a teacher or a doctor. And there's no intentionality. There's no discipline with any aspect of that. They just kind of, they're passive. Whatever happens, happens. Whatever doors open, they just open. I've known a lot of young soccer players over the years. And these have been mostly young men who wanted to be on a soccer team, who wanted to get on a particular soccer team, or who wanted to be goalie. And it's interesting. I've asked each of them as they've mentioned to me, hey, Pastor Max, I got tryouts in 2 months. And I'll ask them, so what are you doing to get ready for tryouts? It's fascinating to me. Most of them, oh, not much. Occasionally, some of them will say, oh, well, I'm practicing. I'm doing these drills. I've arranged to meet with somebody who's kind of coaching me on my technique and my form. I remember I sat down this year with someone who's graduating from Asbury University, and they grew up as a missionary kid in Ecuador. And of course, in Ecuador, everybody plays soccer, so they played soccer, and they were on citywide teams in Quito, so they thought they were hot stuff. And when they arrived at Asbury as a freshman, they thought, oh, I'm going to be goalie. I've got this whole thing. Boom! I've got this whole thing sewed up. Only they didn't anticipate that at Asbury there would be other missionary kids from other parts of the world that also loved soccer the way they love soccer in Ecuador. And there were 3 young men who were already in the position of goalie. And so this person said, freshman year was rough because I thought I was going to be the big soccer star on campus, and it turns out, no. He said, I had to wait until the second half of my junior year before I ever got out onto the field in a game as the goalie. Commitment is the virtue focus for the month of may. And we define commitment as making a plan and putting it into practice. Making a plan and putting it into practice. Now, it seems kind of really like a weird way to define commitment. I mean, you kind of think of commitment as like some version of loyalty or stick-to-it-ness. But commitment is really more than just that. It's more than just stick-to-it-ness. Making a plan and putting it into practice. Let me just flesh this out. There are people in life that love a particular sports team. They're Packers fans, right? And they might say to you, man, I love the Packers. It's one thing to love the Packers. It's another thing to be a committed fan. A committed fan has several jerseys. They've mapped out the entire game schedule a year in advance, and they've cleared their calendar, and there isn't anything that's going to interfere, prevent them from watching the game, right? Committed fans are in a different category than people who just love the Packers. I'm talking to you, Josh Lanier. So when it comes to commitment, this virtue of commitment, I think we can understand that it's more than just really loving something. It's more than just saying, well, I really love X. There's a plan to it. There's something that's put into practice. A lot of people, I found over the years, approach their faith the way people approach all these other different things in life. Well, I love the Packers. I love sewing. I love soccer. I love the outdoors. I love Jesus. I love the church. But it's passive. Whatever happens, happens. There's no active plan. There's no discipline when it comes to their faith. And that's exactly what the Apostle Paul has to say to us in this section from his letter to the Corinthians, 1 Corinthians. And I'm just going to read 3-4 verses we're going to be in. So 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 24 to 27. Don't you realize, Paul writes, that in a race everyone runs, but only one person gets the prize. So run to win. All athletes are disciplined in their training. They do it to win a prize that will fade away, but we do it for an eternal prize. So I run with purpose in every step. I'm not just shadow boxing. I discipline my body like an athlete, training it to do what it should. Otherwise, I fear that after preaching to others, I myself might be disqualified. It's a favorite passage to read if you're the chaplain of a sports team, right? So Paul uses this imagery of a race. He uses it actually several times in several different letters. But for the Corinthians, they would have something very particular in mind. So every 2 to 3 years in the city of Corinth, they hosted what was called the Isthmian Games. I can never say that word. Isthmian Games. Athletes would train for 10 months prior to these games. The winner would receive a crown, often made of celery or pine or olives, a wreath that would go around the top of their head. Think, pictures or paintings you've seen or statues of Roman emperors, a wreath just like that. But they would also receive some other kind of prizes because of the win. Often these winners would get meals provided to them for life. And then they would often have a statue made in their honor or a relief in a wall commemorating their victory. Dio Chrysostom wrote this of the Isthmian Games. They sprint or wrestle or jump. They box, throw the spear, and hurl the discus. And Paul says, so run to win. All athletes are disciplined. The Greek word used there for disciplined is blah, 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 blah. I can't even say it. It's got all these consonants together. But it's actually the word that we translate in other places, self-control. So Paul says all athletes, everyone engaged in this competition, exercises self-control. Athletes can't afford to be overconfident. They can't think to themselves, oh, I totally got this. Remember that Asbury incoming freshman from Ecuador? No, they've got to train. They've got to be disciplined. They've got to have self-control, right? Now, we know from Paul's letters that self-control is a fruit of the Spirit. It's a gift of God's Spirit working inside of us to change the world around us. But this gift isn't a passive gift. In the Old Testament, the Israelites are given a gift. They're given the gift of the promised land. God says, I am giving you this land. I give you this land. It's a gift. Did they just sit back and go, well, we got this promised land, all them Canaanites, woohoo! We're just going to sit around and watch for it to happen. No. What did they do? They had to actually take cities. They marched around Jericho. They fought in battles. There was an active, dynamic quality to them receiving this gift of the promised land. Self-control, the way Paul conceives of it, involves our emotions and, yes, our mind and our will. 50 plus years ago, there was a man named Walter Mischel, and he conducted a series of experiments with 5-year-old kids. He would put them in a room and sit them at a table, and he placed a marshmallow on the table, and he told them, do not eat the marshmallow. And then he went into an adjacent room and waited 15 minutes. And he clocked and timed them. And this is what he found. The kids who waited the longest before succumbing to temptation and eating the marshmallow that was right in front of them, the kids who waited the longest had the highest ACT scores years later. They had lower rates of cocaine and alcohol addictions. They had lower body mass index, the lower BMIs. They were thinner. And they earned more advanced degrees than the kids who immediately ate the marshmallow as soon as Walter left the room. If you're going to limit some freedoms in your life, it takes discipline. If you're going to win, you got to say no to some things that your body wants to do. I just want to stay in bed. You're going to have to say no to some things your body wants to do. And Paul then says this in verse 26. So I run with purpose in every step. I'm not just shadow boxing. Shadow boxing is like punching in the air with nothing to hit. And Paul's saying, no, I have directed energy toward this goal, toward the finish line, toward winning the race. And then he wraps it up, verse 27. I discipline my body like an athlete, training it to do what it should. Otherwise, I fear that after preaching to others, I myself might be disqualified. Now, Paul isn't talking about salvation here when he says disqualified. He tells us in Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 and 9, he says this, God saved you by his grace when you believed, and you can't take credit for it. It is a gift from God. Salvation is not a reward for the good things we've done, so none of us can boast about it. And then in John chapter 10, Jesus says this in verses 27 to 29. He says, my sheep listen to my voice. I know them and they follow me. I give them eternal life and they will never perish. No one can snatch them away from me. For my Father has given them to me, and he's more powerful than anyone else. No one can snatch them from the Father's hand. The Father and I are one. So You cannot earn salvation. We talk about this regularly at Team Generations. Salvation is a gift. You cannot earn it. This disqualified thing that Paul is talking about here is failing to win others over to Christ, is failing to gain a hearing for the gospel. This whole section of 1 Corinthians chapter 9, Paul is talking about setting aside his rights and his liberties. He says, hey, as an apostle, I have a right for you to financially support me, but I've never asked for it. In fact, I've worked as a tent maker, making my own way, paying my own way. I haven't insisted on that right. I've set it aside. And then he says, my rights as an apostle, I've set them aside in order to win over people to Jesus Christ, in order to win a hearing for the gospel. Why would he do that? Again, he wants to win over others. That's in part what he has in mind about this prize, this winning the race. And of course, the larger application for us is we're called to set aside our rights and our preferences in order to reach others who are not like us. All right? Let me ask a question in light of what Paul writes to these Corinthian believers some 2,000 years ago. When it comes to your faith, would you say that you've been relatively passive about it? Or would you say that you have been active about it? And if you needed to be more active when it comes to your faith, what would you need to set aside and what would you need to pick up? Kind of like an athlete training for a competition. What would you need to not do and what would you need to do? Let me suggest some application points, and I'm going to be talking about these in depth over the next several weeks at Generations Community Church. First and foremost, don't be a spectator. Don't be a spectator. Joshua 24:15. Choose this day whom you will serve. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. In the lobby of our facility here, we have the path of a disciple, the pathway of a disciple laid out, head, heart, and hands. A disciple is someone who makes a decision. Yes, I will follow Jesus. Jesus leads, I follow. Heart, Jesus is changing me over time from the inside out. And then hands, I'm on mission with Jesus to reach a lost and hurting world. Don't be a spectator. Be engaged in the competition, right? I know this as a kayaker. In this time of year, if I go kayaking and I think to myself, man, it'd be great to go for a swim. The thing I don't do is put my toe in the water and try and slowly get in. That water's 64 degrees. The only way to do that is to jump in, okay? Is to jump in. Jump in this race. Malcolm Gladwell, in his book Outliers several years ago, he said it takes 10,000 hours to make someone an expert. Now that's been disputed since then because it's not just logging the time, but it's developing a mastery of it, a mastery, whether that's music or sports or whatever it is, right? But I want to map out 4 key ways, right? Things that you can and should pick up. First is hear. God still speaks, and God still speaks through his word. Are you regularly and consistently hearing God by reading the Bible, hearing the Bible, studying the Bible, being in the Bible, having the Bible come into you? And remember, when I was a kid, we would memorize scriptures, but memorizing scriptures, you don't just do that to do it. Part of the reason that you memorize scripture is so that when you're in a moment where you're despairing, where you're troubled, where you're anxious, where you're worried, that scripture comes to mind, right? It comes to mind and heart. Hear. Another thing is pray, right? There's this dialogue, this talking and listening to God. There are these moments where the little boy Samuel is sleeping outside the tabernacle, and this voice keeps crying out. Little Samuel doesn't know that it's actually God trying to talk to him. Samuel had to learn to cultivate ears so that he could hear the voice of God, right? Prayer is another thing that another discipline, another tool, another habit. Talking. Yes, we are people of the book, and we have good news. And part of the way that life works is when you have good news, you talk about it, right? It's this witnessing part, bearing witness to Jesus Christ, the risen Jesus Christ, and what God is doing in your life and has done in your life, right? Talk. And then lastly, live. And I'm going to flesh this out the last week of May, but really when I talk about live, I'm talking about radical love and radical generosity. And these are just 4 skills, 4 habits, in a sense, that help us build that muscle of faith. All right? I want to close by reading this passage again. And now that we've had a chance to kind of flesh it out a little bit more. And again, Paul's wrapping up this whole section where he says, there's all these things that I could claim. There's all these rights that I have, and I'm setting them aside because I want to win others to Christ, and I want to win a hearing for the gospel. And he says this, don't you realize that in a race, everyone runs, but only one person gets the prize. So run to win. All athletes are disciplined in their training. They do it to win a prize that will fade away, but we do it for an eternal prize. So I run with purpose in every step. I'm not just shadow boxing. I discipline my body like an athlete, training it to do what it should. Otherwise, I fear that after preaching to others, I myself might be disqualified. Team Generations run to win. I believe in you guys.